Could you pass a university-level music theory entrance exam? Most colleges and universities require all their incoming freshmen to take a placement exam to see should they start in Theory 1, should they skip ahead a little to Theory 2 or 3, or more likely, should they start back in the fundamentals class even before they get to Theory 1? So today, I'm going to be taking you through Northern Illinois University's study guide for this diagnostic test. This should be really interesting for you, especially if you're planning on going to a university or college someday. But even if not, just you general musicians, kind of knowing, do you have what would be considered a basic music theory understanding? Let's jump in. Okay, the exam starts off with fundamentals. Name the note. Now, you do kind of have to know the system here because there's an older system for naming notes. There's a newer system. So if you don't know the system, you're kind of in trouble from the very beginning. But yes, F4, they even give you an example to kind of help you out a little bit. But F4 is right here. That is what we call middle C is C4. If you don't know the system, it's pretty simple. C4 is C. The only confusing thing about this system, the numbers start over on the C. So this is C4. You go lower, you get C3, lower C2, lower C1. That's all great, but the numbers start. This is B3 and then C4. So even though the letters of the alphabet restart on A, the number restarts on C. B5 then would not be the B right above that, but it would be the B2 above that because F up to B, then you have to add another octave for the B5. And then the C5 though, will be the C lower than that because, once again, the numbers start over on C. So C5 is actually lower than B5. And then they want to see, can you do it in bass clef, which all the piano players will laugh at and say, who can't do it in bass clef? But there are a lot of musicians who only read one clef or another. And then you see over here, they say, can you do it in alto clef or C clef, whatever you want to call this. And then even the pianist will shudder and just a few instrumentalists like the violist will rub their hands together and say, this is our time to shine. These clefs are not that confusing. If you see these clefs and you immediately just panic, I don't blame you for not being able to read fluently on them, but they're not that hard to figure out. The middle thing, the middle of the symbol is middle C. C4. So this is actually easy if you know that, because if this is C4, you got to go up for the G. And again, you just have to count intervals. The top line is G because the middle line is C, E, G. So again, this is kind of a good clef to play in to improve your sight reading. But practically speaking, I've been asked to actually read this like a small handful of times in my life. And then at the end here, they're like, let's make it a little more tricky. And they move middle C up a line. So these are movable C clefs. Now, these are the two most common of them, but they're movable C clefs. So you can say this is C. So now this is middle C. Where's A4? Well, A4 is going to be way up here because A4 is higher than middle C. It doesn't really even matter from a piano point of view or lots of music point of view. It's just really practical. Imagine going through a whole years and years of college, and every time someone says, hey, play the D a little louder, and you go, which one? And they're like, well, the one in your left hand thumb. You're like, well, I'm actually using my two finger on that D or whatever. Just say D3, D5. It is super convenient, but no, it doesn't necessarily mean you're good at music. It's just a system you need to know. Okay, let's move on to scales. Here they're just wanting to see if you know the basic major minor scales. So they wrote G major out for you. Up next they have B major. You have to remember you're in bass clef, I guess, at the beginning of the line. That's one of those things you got to be careful on these entrance exams. Always check your clefs. It's like when you do math and you do a really complicated math problem, but for some reason you said 7 plus 4 is 12. So you get the whole thing wrong, right? That's infuriating. When you're reading this stuff or doing exams like this, always check your clefs. Always double check like the time signature. Those can really mess you up for a lot of points, even though like it's a silly mistake, right? And then E flat melodic minor is a lot meaner. If you don't know those, that's just one of those things you're going to have to memorize in the very early stages of Theory 1 in college. And some people, depending on your instrument or possibly voice, you've never had to learn major and minor scales. They will make you learn them. And if you're a musician who's not going to college, you should probably just know your scales anyway, because it saves you time in the future. It saves you time in music theory class. You don't have to keep reviewing them over and over again. But honestly, being good at scales as a pianist, it's not like we sit here and play scales in our pieces all the time. Some pieces do, But really the point of being good at scales is to be like, I'm in E flat minor right now. I'm not just like learning random notes. Okay, we're not leaving keys yet. Up next, I want you to name some keys. They're going to tell you the key. You have to write out the key signature. This is pretty standard stuff. I feel like they drill a lot in high school music theory, then especially in college, which is good. You just need to know when you see a key signature what it is. So like D major, 2 sharps, C sharp minor, 4 sharps. There's a pattern to it. You can do the whole like circle of fifth, C, G, go up another fifth. D has 2 sharps, A has 3 sharps, I almost said 4. E has 4 sharps, B has 5 sharps, F sharp has 6 sharps. You can memorize that. If you do it that way, there's nothing wrong with that. Eventually, it just become ingrained in you. Like, okay, D, 2, C sharp minor, 4, E flat major, 3 flats, F sharp minor, 3 sharps, F minor, 4 flats. You'll get pretty good at them. But yeah, this will be pretty much every place you apply to will ask you to do this on entrance exam. And if they don't, they will definitely want you to be really good at this first semester theory 1. All right, so on to intervals. Now, the thing with intervals you have to know is that you have to keep the interval correct. You cannot respell things enharmonically. You will definitely get it wrong, and you should. If you've watched my channel before, you know I talk a lot about things like there'll be an augmented 6, and someone will say in the comments, oh, that might be a minor 7th, or it's just a minor 7th. It's not, because the composer for some reason spells it F to D sharp. They're saying F to D, that's a 6. They're spelling an augmented 6. For whatever reason, that might be important for that piece to write it that way. So that being said, the first one here is a perfect 4th. They wrote it out for you. You cannot say F to A sharp, because F to A is a 3rd. Thirds are every other letter name. So you can't say F to A sharp, because that would be an augmented 3rd. We don't want that. We want a perfect 4th. The next one here is pretty tricky. G sharp, major 3rd. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what is a 3rd above G? Well, a 2nd would be A, right? G, A. So a 3rd would be G to B. So you have to write some kind of a B. If you do it in this system, it's much easier. Like you see that, G sharp, just say it's a G, it's a major 3rd. Just tell your brain, I have to write some kind of a B, because a B is a 3rd above G. Now it happens to be G sharp and a major 3rd, so it's going to be B sharp. You can't write C. G to C looks like a 4th on the page. It looks like a 4th in your brain. The letter G, A, B, C. We got to write a 3rd. Okay, next one here's a little easier. B flat, minor 7th. A flat. I mean, it's tricky because it's a big interval, but that one's pretty straightforward because there's no tricks there. On to the next one there, they give you an example of a major 3rd going down, and then they give you a diminished 3rd. That's tricky. So diminished intervals and augmented intervals, take what you already have, make them bigger or make them smaller. So we have an E flat. Once again, this is the 3rd. Tell yourself E. The letter is E, right? We're in basic clef again, by the way. The letter is E. What is a 3rd below E? C. It has to be C. A 2nd would be D. A 3rd is C. So if it's C, a diminished 3rd would be C sharp. It looks like a 2nd. When you play on the piano, you might want to write D flat, but it's not a D flat, because E to D would be a 2nd. That would just be a major 2nd. But for whatever reason, they want you to write a diminished 3rd. And sometimes in pieces, composers will spell diminished 3rds, as stupid as that looks at first, because it's a good theoretical reason. Diminished 3rd. Okay, we are now on to the world of rhythm. Show how many notes of the shorter duration would equal the longer duration. So for example, it would take 3 16th notes to equal a dotted 8th note. How many 16th notes does it take to equal a dotted quarter note? That's actually kind of a confusing question. 4 16th notes would be 1 quarter, right? So 4 to 1. Well, a dotted quarter adds 50%. So if you have a dotted quarter, that would be 6. 6 16th notes would be 1 dotted quarter. But when you dot a dot, you don't add half the original back on again. You add half of the first dot back on. So in this case, 4 16th notes, 1 quarter, 6 16th notes, dotted quarter. If you put another dot on there, you're going to take half of the new half. So you're going to take half of 2, which is 1. So it's going to be 7 total 16th notes. And that's pretty tricky for most high school students. Some will know for sure, but I'm sure that's very confusing for most. I'm sure most of them just hold them for as long as you possibly can, then play 2 fast chords. So 8th notes and a whole note, that's not too tricky, just literally 8, because 8 eighth notes is equals to 1 whole note. And then how many half notes are in a dotted whole note? So again, the dots at 50%. So you have a whole note is 4 beats. If you want to think in this system, at 50%, that would be 6. So 3 half notes equals 1 dotted whole note. Up next, I want you to provide the best time signature. Best is an important word here because often there's more than one option, but there's typically a best one. So this is a pretty clear 6/8, 2 groups of 3/8 notes up first. The next one is a really clear 4/4, dot, 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 dot. You can see those 4 beats. There are 4 quarter notes in that measure, but also the beaming really agrees with that. The next one, probably best described as 3/8, though honestly the third and fourth ones are pretty tricky. The fourth one's probably best described as 6/4, which you can know because the beaming, you can see how they said these eighth notes belong together. So you're like, okay, why does 3 quarter notes belong together and these 3 do not? Why did they beam that together? Well, they're kind of implying a da 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 da. So kind of a 6/4, but those last two are kind of weird examples. Okay, up next, I want to see how you do with chords. And this is definitely a section not to stress about if it's hard for you, because this is what you will be learning in theory. There are probably very few, I'm guessing, college freshmen who are completely good at all of these with no kind of studying ahead of time. So up here we have the fifth of a major minor 7th chord, a dominant 7th chord is C. So you have to kind of figure out the chord around it. If you're just totally lost here, this could be pretty tricky. But the next one, for example, says G sharp is the third of a major 7th chord. So it's going to be an E major 7th chord, E, G sharp, B, D sharp. You have to kind of know, okay, you have to kind of take 2 steps back. You're like, what's a major 7th chord? And also which major 7th chord would have E as the third? The next one says a 7th of a half diminished 7th chord. Again, a pretty mean one, especially the spelling of this one's going to be A flat, C flat, E double flat, G flat. The next one is the 5th of a fully diminished 7th chord. Again, if you know some harmony and stuff, this isn't too tricky. You're like, which fully diminished 7th chord has A flat as the 5th? Well, a D, D, F, A flat, C flat. But if you've never heard of a fully diminished 7th chord, this is going to be terrifying stuff. And then we move on to part writing, and it even says use proper voice leading. And this truly is the death of a lot of college music theory students. Like, they were doing okay with the fundamentals, they're spelling some chords out of context, key signatures, scales, and then it's like, okay, now we're going to add all these rules like don't write parallel perfect fifths or parallel perfect octaves, which you can tell if you're trying to sound like the classical kind of core Baroque classical romantic eras. That's not a very good sound for those styles. But I understand for lots of instrumentalists who only deal with a single note, or singers, or even lots of pianists, this is just so abstract and difficult for us to wrap your mind around. And they give a really mean example, in my opinion. One of the trickiest things to do with part writing is when you have like a scale in your left hand, because it's so hard to not make perfect fifths somewhere in there, but it's also hard to like not run out of notes or not have a voice do a huge leap over another voice when you get this nonstop marching up. So there's kind of a trick to this one, and the trick is when you get to that third chord. Oh, you can't see my right hand. You can like double up the A, have the alto and the tenor sing the A. I wouldn't know what they meant by proper part leading when I was 18 years old going to college. I would have just written out the chords, maybe try to make them somewhat smooth, but I wouldn't have known to avoid like parallel fifths. But for the few people who are maybe not scared off by this, up next they want you to analyze some of the chords for yourself, which I actually find a lot easier. It's much easier to analyze than to like generate your own progression, especially again tricky ones like that. So they just say, hey, here's a little thing. You wouldn't probably have a piano to play, by the way, but here's something in the key of C. Analyze these chords. You know, okay, 1 chord, 5 7, 1 chord, 5, no 7, 1 chord, maybe a 2, a 4 to 2, or if it's just one big chord, a 2 7 chord, 5 7, A minor deceptive cadence. So they want you to kind of write that stuff out. It also has some nice little German. Mein liebster Freund hat mich verlassen. Mit ihm ist Schlaf und Ruhe dahin. I think that means, correct me if I'm wrong, Germans, but my dear friend or my best friend or my dearest friend has left me. Has mich verlassen. Verlassen has left me. With him is rest and peace, like within, like kind of within him, there's like rest and calmness or peace. I'm guessing so. You can fix my translation down in the comments. And then the test moves on to chromatic harmony. And now, honestly, if you ace the chromatic harmony section as an 18-year-old, they would probably either think you cheated on the test, or maybe they would call you into the office and like quiz you further. Because if you actually know all that, I don't know, maybe you don't even need some of theory 3. If you knew everything to this point and you could spell a French augment 6 chord in the key of B flat, how many of you are not in college, you are high school students and lower, and you see French augment 6 in the key of B flat, and your brain just like immediately spelled the chord, like in a relative, maybe not immediate, but a relatively quick time frame? Let me know if you were out there, because in my experience, if you're going to college for piano, you probably have really drilled the piano side of things. And some people are entering college extremely high level in piano, but they're not like, going to be spelling a Neapolitan chord in the key of F minor. Maybe a Neapolitan chord in the key of F minor, but probably not a French augmented 6 in the key of B flat. I really like how this test ends with these 3 really mean questions. They're like, listen here, buddy, if you've gotten everything else right this whole time and you're feeling good about yourself, like, wow, I really know everything on this college music theory diagnostic exam. They're like, what's a passacaglia? What's a recitative and aria? Maybe you're like an instrumentalist who knows all these chords. Or like, well, what's a recitative and aria? And what's not a rondo forms? But the first page of this would honestly be really helpful to be good at before you got to the university music theory classes. Like, you're going to have a huge head start and way less stress as a freshman if you were really confident with what the letters were called, how intervals worked, how basic rhythms work, and also key signatures. It's going to save you a lot of that first couple weeks of stress where you're like, I gotta like crunch all these key signatures. And then my personal advice for harmony, and this would apply to any of you who maybe want to go to college someday, or you just play music as an adult and you love it. First, get really good at just spelling chords. Like D, F sharp A, it's a D major chord. Pick a layer name and go, I'm going to spell a major, major 7th chord from there. Get good at those like basic chords, major, minor, diminished. Get good at the 7th chords, the major, 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 minor, minor, minor. And then also maybe the 2 diminished chords, half diminished and fully diminished 7ths. If you're really good at all that, when you stick the Roman numerals with it in college, it's pretty easy and intuitive. You're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. If you get to college and you're really struggling spelling A major, A, C sharp, E, or if you're just trying to play Chopin for fun and you don't quickly recognize that as an A major chord, that's kind of a problem. That's going to take a long time to ever get to the point of understanding Roman numerals because you're stuck on letter names. So my personal advice before you stress about the Roman numerals and stuff, first just get really good at spelling chords. And for sure with a video like this, let me know if you have any specific questions down in the comments. See you guys.